Frank and Dorothy stood on the porch of a building made of cold, grey stone. It was a place that had been built to hold people in, but for them, it had become the one place that let them be free. Around them, life hummed. The scent of tomato plants from Mr. Henderson's garden mingled with the faint, clean smell of sawdust from Frank's new workshop. A baby's happy gurgle drifted from an open window. They had taken a place of despair, an abandoned county jail, and filled it with hope. They had been cast out by their own blood, their sons selling the family farm out from under them for a pittance, leaving them to fade away in a cheap motel. But their sons had forgotten something. They had forgotten about the history buried beneath the barn floor. They had forgotten about the steel and concrete vault their grandfather had built, a secret kept for a generation. And in that vault was the key not to revenge, but to survival. It was the seed from which this strange, beautiful, and resilient new life had grown. A life built with old hands, stubborn hearts, and the forgotten skills of a lifetime. This was their victory, not loud or triumphant, but as quiet and solid as the stone walls around them. But to understand how they got here, how a retired carpenter and a bookkeeper transformed a derelict prison into a sanctuary, you have to go back. You have to go back to the day the world they had built over 56 years was torn down in a single afternoon. The farm was more than land. It was a living record of their lives. Frank knew this in the grain of the barn wood, timbers his own father had raised and which he himself had mended 100 times. Dorothy knew it in the worn linoleum of the kitchen floor, where she had charted the growth of their 2 sons in pencil marks, now faded but still visible if you caught the light just right. They had been married 56 years. A lifetime measured in seasons, in planting and in harvest, in the slow, steady accumulation of shared moments. Frank, with his hands gnarled from labor but still impossibly gentle, could fix anything. A tractor engine, a leaky roof, a child's broken toy. He was a man of quiet competence, who spoke little but did much. His workshop was his sanctuary, a cathedral of sawdust and oil, where every tool had its place and every piece of scrap lumber held potential. Dorothy was the anchor. While Frank worked the land and the wood, she worked the numbers. For 40 years, she had kept the books for a local grain co-op, her ledgers a testament to a mind that saw the world in columns of order and balance. She ran their household the same way, with precision, foresight, and a deep, unspoken understanding of its delicate ecosystem. She knew the cost of seed, the price of fuel, the due date of every bill. She was the planner, the observer, the quiet strategist who ensured their modest life remained a stable one. They had provided. For their sons, Mark and David, they had provided everything. A safe home. A full table. College educations they themselves had never dreamed of. They had encouraged them to go out into the world, to be more than farmers. And they had. Mark became a real estate developer in the city, his life a series of glossy brochures and sharp suits. David followed, taking a job in finance, a man who lived in the shadow of his older brother's ambition. The sons visited less and less. The calls became shorter. Life, they said, was busy. Frank and Dorothy understood. Or they tried to. They had raised them to fly, after all. They couldn't be angry when they stayed aloft. So they continued their life, a quiet rhythm of 2. The farm was enough. It had always been enough. The day it ended was a Tuesday in late October. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the kind that made the dying leaves on the oaks look like bits of fire. Frank was in his workshop, carefully restoring an old rocking chair. Dorothy was in the kitchen, preparing a pot of soup, the windows steamed from the warmth. A sleek, black sedan they didn't recognize crunched up the gravel driveway. Mark got out of the driver's side, David from the passenger's. They didn't look like they belonged here anymore. Their city clothes were too new, their faces too strained. Mark. David. What a surprise, Dorothy said, wiping her hands on her apron as she came out onto the porch. Frank emerged from his workshop, a question in his eyes. Mom. Dad, Mark said. His tone was clipped, efficient. The tone he used with clients, not family. We need to talk. They sat at the kitchen table, the one Frank had built from a fallen oak on the property 40 years ago. The soup simmered on the stove, its comforting aroma suddenly feeling out of place. Mark laid a sheaf of papers on the table. It's about the farm. David stared at his hands, avoiding their eyes. The upkeep is getting to be too much, Mark began. The property taxes, the insurance, the cost of maintenance. You're not getting any younger. We've been worried. Frank stiffened. The farm is fine. I take care of it. Dad, be realistic, Mark said, a hint of impatience in his voice. That roof on the barn is going to need replacing soon. The tractor is 30 years old. It's a money pit. You're on a fixed income. We can't subsidize it forever. Dorothy felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Subsidize? They had never asked for a dime. She knew their finances to the penny. They were fine. They were careful. We manage, Mark, she said, her voice quiet but firm. It's not about managing, Mark said, pushing the papers forward. It's about being smart. Proactive. We found a buyer. A developer. The room went silent. The only sound was the gentle bubbling of the soup. Frank looked from Mark to David, then back to the papers. He didn't reach for them. You're selling the farm? We sold the farm, Mark corrected him. The deal is done. Dorothy felt the floor drop out from under her. She looked at David, her younger son, the one who always had a softer heart. He wouldn't meet her gaze. He just stared at the wood grain of the table, as if it held some profound secret. You can't, Frank said, his voice a low rumble. This is our home. This is an asset, Mark countered. And it was being mismanaged. We have power of attorney, Dad. We signed the papers this morning, he tapped the folder. It's all legal and binding. Power of attorney. Dorothy remembered signing those papers 5 years ago, after Frank's heart surgery. A precaution, the lawyer had said. In case you're ever unable to make decisions for yourselves. They had trusted them. They had trusted their own sons. How much? Dorothy asked. The bookkeeper in her taking over, a desperate attempt to find logic in the chaos. Enough, Mark said evasively. How much, Mark, she repeated. He sighed, annoyed. The sale price was $2 million. After clearing the mortgage you took out for David's business loan and settling some other debts, your share comes to $40,000. It's been deposited into your savings account. $40,000. For a lifetime. For 50 acres of prime land. The number was an insult. A violation. The mortgage for David's failed business venture. They had co-signed, of course. He was their son. The new owner wants to take possession at the end of the week, Mark continued, oblivious or indifferent to the devastation he was causing. So we need to get you packed. Packed? Frank's voice was barely a whisper. Packed for where? We found a great place, David finally spoke, his voice thin and reedy. A retirement community. It's very nice. It has a meal plan. Mark shot him a look. A look that said, stick to the plan. The retirement community has a waiting list, Mark said smoothly. So, for the short term, we've arranged a place for you to stay. A motel, just until your spot opens up. We'll handle the move. Just pack a suitcase with your essentials. Clothes, medications. We'll take care of the rest. Take care of the rest. The words hung in the air, obscene. They meant they would dispose of their lives. The furniture Frank had built. The photographs. The books. The rocking chair he was so carefully mending. 56 years of life, reduced to the rest. They didn't fight. They were in shock. It was like being told of a sudden death. The body goes numb. The mind refuses to process. Dorothy went to the bedroom and packed a single suitcase. Frank stood motionless in the kitchen, staring at the papers on the table. He looked old. older than he had looked that morning. An hour later, they were in the back of Mark's sedan, pulling away from the farm. Dorothy looked back, trying to memorize it. The white house, the red barn, the way the sun lit up the western pasture. She saw the kitchen window, steamed and warm. The soup was still on the stove. They drove for an hour, away from the country and into the sprawling, anonymous suburbs. They passed a sign that said, Oak Ridge Retirement Villas, and for a moment, Dorothy felt a sliver of hope. But they kept driving. They pulled into the parking lot of a long, low building with a flickering neon sign, the Starlight Motel. It was wedged between a highway and a strip mall. The paint was peeling. Mark got out and went to the office. He came back with a key card. Room 112. We've paid for the first month. That should give you plenty of time before your room at the villas is ready. He handed the key to Dorothy. David opened the trunk and pulled out their 2 small suitcases. He set them on the cracked pavement. We have to get back, Mark said, already sliding back into the driver's seat. Meetings. Dorothy looked at him, her son, a stranger. When will we hear about the community? Soon, Mark said. They'll call you. We left them your cell number. He didn't look at her. He was looking at his watch. David lingered for a moment. Mom. It's for the best. Dorothy just looked at him. She didn't have any words left. He flinched, then hurried into the car. The black sedan pulled out of the parking lot and merged onto the highway, disappearing into the river of traffic. Frank and Dorothy stood on the sidewalk in front of room 112 of the Starlight Motel, a suitcase at each of their feet. The sun was setting. The world had gone cold. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and disinfectant. The carpet was a swirl of brown and orange stains. A single window looked out onto the parking lot, its view partially blocked by a large, humming ice machine. There were 2 double beds with thin, polyester bedspreads, a small table with 2 chairs, and a television bolted to the wall. Frank sat on the edge of one of the beds. He didn't take off his coat. He just sat there, his large, capable hands resting on his knees, looking lost. Dorothy placed her suitcase on the other bed and opened it. Inside were clothes, toiletries, and their important documents, birth certificates, marriage license, social security cards, which she always kept in a tidy file folder. She moved with a methodical calm that had governed her life, a defense against the chaos that was crashing down around them. They didn't speak for a long time. The only sounds were the hum of the ice machine and the distant roar of the highway. The days that followed blurred into a gray monotony. They woke up late. They ate food from the motel's vending machine or the fast food restaurants across the street. Dorothy would go to the laundromat. Frank would watch television, flipping through the channels without interest. The life had gone out of his eyes. His hands, always busy, were now still. He would pick up a loose thread on the bedspread and roll it between his fingers, or trace the patterns in the stained carpet with the toe of his boot. He was a man built for purpose, and he had been stripped of it. He was withering. Dorothy tried to maintain a routine. She would call the Oak Ridge Retirement Villas every morning. Just checking on the status of Frank and Dorothy Miller, she would say, her voice polite and steady. The answer was always the same. A cheerful, disembodied voice would inform her that they had no record of their application. Our sons, Mark and David Miller, were handling it, she would explain. I'm sorry. We have no one by that name on our waiting list. She called her sons. The first few times, Mark answered. These things take time, Mom. It's a bureaucracy. Be patient. Then he stopped answering. His calls went straight to voicemail. Hi, you've reached Mark Miller. I'm away from my desk. Please leave a message. David answered once, his voice full of guilt and panic. Mark is handling it, Mom. I don't know the details. I have to go. He hung up. After that, he stopped answering too. They didn't call. They never called. A week passed. Then 2. The first month's rent was nearly up. Dorothy checked their bank account online, using the motel's slow, sputtering Wi-Fi. The $40,000 was there. A digital monument to their betrayal. She paid for another month at the motel. The number shrank. They were invisible. Discarded. Two old people in a roadside motel, erased from the world they had built. Frank spent most of his days staring out the window. He watched the cars come and go. He watched people load their luggage, their faces full of purpose, on their way to somewhere else. One afternoon, he saw a maintenance man trying to fix a broken fence post at the edge of the parking lot. The man was struggling, using the wrong tool. Frank watched for 10 minutes, his hands twitching. He finally stood up, put on his coat, and walked outside. Dorothy watched from the window. She saw Frank speak to the man. She saw him take the tool, make an adjustment, and then, with a few deft movements, secure the post. It was straight and solid. The maintenance man clapped him on the shoulder and shook his hand. When Frank came back into the room, there was a flicker of the old light in his eyes. His hammer was too light, he said, and it was the most he had said in a week. But the flicker died quickly. There were no more fences to mend. There was only the room, the television, and the hum of the ice machine. The low point came on a rainy Wednesday night in their 6th week at the motel. The money was dwindling faster than Dorothy had anticipated. Another month's rent, food, a prescription for Frank's blood pressure medication. She sat at the small table, her laptop open, the bank balance glowing like an accusation. Less than $30,000 remained. Frank was lying on the bed, facing the wall. He had a cold, and his breathing was shallow. The dampness of the room had settled into his bones. "Frank," she said softly. "We need to think about what's next." He didn't answer. "The money won't last forever. The retirement community. I don't think they're ever going to call." The words, spoken aloud for the first time, were both a surrender and a declaration of war. He rolled over slowly. His face was pale, his eyes defeated. "There is no what's next, Dorothy. This is it. This is the end of the line." "No," she said, her voice sharp with a sudden, fierce resolve. "No, it is not." She closed the laptop. She felt a familiar surge of clarity, the same feeling she'd get when a ledger wouldn't balance and she had to hunt down the single, misplaced number that was throwing everything into chaos. The world had been thrown into chaos. She needed to find the number. She went to her suitcase and pulled out the file folder of their important documents. She had grabbed it off the desk in their home office as they were leaving. In her haste, she had also swept up a stack of other papers that had been sitting with it. Old tax returns, receipts, and, at the very bottom, a thick, canvas-bound folio. She hadn't looked through it. She hadn't had the heart. It contained the history of the farm. She sat back down at the table and opened the folio. The paper was old and brittle. There were hand-drawn maps of the property, soil surveys from the 1950s, and the original blueprints for the house and barn, drawn in her own father's neat, architectural hand. Her father. He had been a man shaped by the Great Depression and the Cold War. A man who believed in self-reliance, in preparing for the worst. He trusted banks as far as he could throw them and the government even less. He was a builder, like Frank, but also a prepper, long before the term existed. She traced the lines of the barn blueprint with her finger. Her eyes scanned the familiar layout, the main floor, the hayloft, the milking stalls. Then she saw it. A small, square outline beneath the main threshing floor, labeled simply, RC. Root cellar. But it wasn't just a root cellar. She remembered now. Vague, childhood memories. Her father, working late into the night. The sound of a concrete mixer. The delivery of heavy steel plates. He had been secretive about it, telling the neighbors he was shoring up the barn's foundation. But he had told her. "This is the last resort, Dottie," he had said, using his pet name for her. "If everything goes sideways, this is the place we hold on." It wasn't a cellar. It was a vault. He had built it in the early 1960s, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. A concrete and steel box, hidden beneath the floorboards, its entrance concealed under a pile of old equipment. A place to survive a nuclear winter, or an economic collapse. Or, perhaps, a betrayal. Her heart began to beat faster. Mark and David wouldn't know about it. They had never been interested in the farm's history. To them, the barn was just an old, dilapidated building. A liability on a balance sheet. They would have walked right over it 1,000 times without a second thought. Her father had been a man of foresight. What would a man like that put in his last resort vault? Her mind raced. He distrusted paper money. He had always talked about real asset, gold, silver. Things you could hold in your hand. He had inherited a small coin collection from his own father. He had added to it over the years. He would have put it in the vault. And there was something else. A story he used to tell, about a piece of worthless land the county had given his grandfather in exchange for a right-of-way easement back in the 1930s. A forgotten parcel on the far edge of the county. Never sell land, Dottie, he would say. They aren't making any more of it, the deed. The original, unrecorded deed would be with his most important possessions. She looked over at Frank, who had drifted into a restless sleep, his breath catching in his chest. A fierce, protective anger rose in her, so powerful it almost choked her. They would not end like this. She would not let him fade away in this stale, grey room. Her father had built a lifeboat. It was sitting at the bottom of a shipwreck, but it was there. She sat at the table for the rest of the night, the blueprint spread before her, the hum of the ice machine her only companion. She was no longer just an observer. She was a planner. And she was making a plan. When the first grey light of dawn filtered through the grimy window, she stood up and walked over to the bed. She placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "Frank. Wake up." He stirred, his eyes cloudy with sleep and sickness. "What is it?" She held out the blueprint. "I know what we're going to do." She laid it all out for him. The vault. Her father's paranoia. The coins. The deed. She spoke with a calm, unshakable certainty that she didn't entirely feel, but knew he needed to hear. He listened, his expression shifting from weary confusion to cautious interest. He sat up, pushing himself against the headboard. He took the blueprint from her and studied it, his carpenter's eye tracing the lines. Under the threshing floor, he murmured. He always kept the corner piled high with old harnesses and broken plows. He looked at her. "You really think it's still there?" "I know it is," she said. "And our sons don't." A long silence settled between them. Frank stared at the blueprint, but she could see he was looking past it, back across the years. He was seeing the barn, smelling the hay and the dust, feeling the worn floorboards beneath his feet. "The new owners," he began. "The developer. They'll have torn it down by now." The hope in his voice was already starting to fade. "No," Dorothy said quickly. She had already thought of this. "Mark said he was a developer. They don't move in. They tear down and build new. And men like Mark, they are always looking for a bigger profit. He probably sold it to a holding company. It could be sitting empty for months, even years, waiting for permits and plans to be approved." She had already done the research. Using the motel's Wi-Fi, she had searched the county's online property records. The farm had been sold not to a developer, but to a numbered corporation with a mailing address in another state. It was exactly as she'd suspected. A shell. The property was in limbo. "It's sitting there, Frank. Empty." He looked at the blueprint again, then at his own hands. They were pale and soft from weeks of inactivity. How would we even get in? And if we did, how would we open it? Your father built that thing to withstand a bomb. A key, if there ever was one, is long gone. The doubt was creeping back in. He was a practical man, and the practicalities were overwhelming. "We'll find a way," Dorothy said, her voice dropping, becoming more intense. You can fix anything, Frank. You know you can. We just need the tools. We just need a chance. She leaned forward. This is our chance. It's the only one we have. Are we going to die in this room, or are we going to fight? He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just his wife of 56 years, but the fierce, determined girl he had fallen in love with. He saw the strategist, the planner, the woman who had balanced their lives on the tip of a pen for half a century. And he saw that she was not asking. She was telling him. A slow smile touched his lips. It was the first time she had seen him smile in 6 weeks. You've already got it all figured out, don't you, Dottie? Most of it, she admitted. He swung his legs out of the bed and stood up. He seemed taller, his shoulders broader. The sickness that had clung to him seemed to recede. Purpose was a powerful medicine. All right, he said. First thing we need is a vehicle. Something that doesn't look out of place. A van, Dorothy said immediately. An old work van. And tools, he added. A crowbar. Heavy-duty drill. A grinder, maybe. The bookkeeper in Dorothy took over. We have $29,450. A used van will be $3,000, maybe $4,000. Tools, another $1,000. That leaves us with a buffer. Frank nodded, his mind already at work, building a plan out of her strategy. We'll go at night. Less chance of being seen. The decision was made. The air in the room had changed. The stale smell of despair was replaced by something sharp and clean, like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. They were no longer victims. They were conspirators. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of activity. They checked out of the Starlight Motel, the indifferent clerk barely looking up as Dorothy paid the final bill. They left behind the stained carpets and the humming ice machine without a backward glance. They found what they were looking for on a used car lot on the industrial edge of town, a 20-year-old white cargo van. It was dented, rusted in spots, and the engine made a rattling noise, but Frank spent an hour looking it over, his hands running over the engine block, his ear listening to its rough idle. The alternator belt is loose and it needs new plugs, but the frame is solid, he declared. It'll do. Dorothy paid the $4,200 in cash. The salesman, a slick young man who reminded her uncomfortably of Mark, looked at the wad of bills with suspicion, but took the money. An hour later, they drove off the lot, the proud owners of a rattling, anonymous white box on wheels. Their next stop was a pawn shop. Frank moved through the aisles of other people's discarded hopes with a singular focus. He bought a heavy steel crowbar, a socket set, and a powerful, corded drill. He held each tool in his hands, testing its weight and balance. It was the first time he had looked truly alive in months. They spent the night in the van, parked in the far corner of a 24-hour supermarket parking lot. Sleep was impossible. The anticipation was a current running between them. They were a team again. The door and the observer. The carpenter and the bookkeeper. They drove towards the farm the next evening, as dusk was bleeding into night. They took the back roads, the van's headlights cutting a lonely path through the darkness. As they got closer, every landmark was a painful memory. The old stone bridge. The crossroads with the giant oak tree. The turn off to their own road. Frank pulled the van over about a quarter mile from the farm's entrance. We walk from here, he said. No sense leaving tire tracks. They got out. The air was cold and clean, smelling of damp earth and fallen leaves. It was the air of home. They walked in silence, the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel road deafening in the stillness. The farm was dark. No lights in the house. No signs of life. A large, metal sign had been pounded into the ground near the driveway, future site of the Oak Creek Estates. Coming 2025-inch the sign was a fresh wound on the landscape. They slipped past it, keeping to the shadows of the tree line. The house looked forlorn and empty. The barn loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. Frank went to the small side door of the barn, the one he had used 1,000 times. It was locked. A new, shiny padlock hung from the hasp. He looked at it, then pulled the crowbar from the canvas bag he was carrying. "My own barn," he muttered, a bitter edge to his voice. He wedged the tip of the crowbar into the hasp and leaned into it with his whole body. There was a sharp crack of splintering wood, then a screech of protesting metal. The door swung open. They slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind them. The air was thick with the familiar smell of old hay, dust, and engine oil. It was the smell of Frank's entire life. Moonlight filtered through the grimy windows of the hayloft, casting long, eerie shadows across the vast, empty space. The barn had been cleared out. Frank's workshop was gone. The tools, the benches, the lumber, all of it had vanished. The space was cavernous and empty, echoing with the ghosts of a lifetime of work. Frank stood for a long moment, his face a mask of grief. Dorothy touched his arm. "Later, Frank. We have to keep moving." He nodded, his jaw tight. He led the way to the corner of the barn, his footsteps sure and certain even in the dark. The area where the old harnesses and broken equipment had always been piled was now swept clean. There, on the floor, were the wide, ancient planks of the threshing floor. "Here," Frank said. He knelt down, running his hands over the wood. He found the edge of a specific plank and pushed his fingers into the gap. He pried. The board groaned but didn't move. He took the crowbar again. Working carefully, he wedged it under the edge of the board and began to lever it up. It was slow, arduous work. The nails were old and deep. With a final, agonized shriek of wood and metal, the first plank came free. Beneath it was not dirt, but a layer of thick, dark concrete. A surge of triumph shot through Dorothy. "It's here." Frank worked with a feverish energy now. He pulled up another plank, and then another, revealing a square of concrete about 6 feet by 6 feet. And in the center of it, flush with the surface, was a round, steel ring. They cleared the last of the boards away. Frank grabbed the ring with both hands and pulled. Nothing. It was sealed tight with rust and time. He examined the edges. "It's a door." A steel plate set into a frame, he pointed to a spot on the circumference. "There's the lock. It's an old tumbler lock. A good 1 inch. He took out the drill he had bought. He fitted it with the toughest bit he had. "I'm going to have to drill out the tumblers. It'll make a racket." "There's no one to hear it for miles," Dorothy said. He knelt down, positioned the drill bit, and pulled the trigger. The high-pitched scream of metal on metal tore through the silence of the barn. It was a terrible, violent sound. Frank's arms vibrated with the strain. Sparks flew, illuminating his face, grim and determined. It took almost an hour. He went through 2 drill bits. Sweat poured down his face. Finally, with a grinding crunch, the drill bit punched through the last of the lock mechanism. He turned off the drill. The silence that rushed back in was profound. He put the crowbar into the hole where the lock had been and pried. There was a deep, groaning sound from below. Then, with a sudden release of pressure, the heavy steel door lifted a few inches. Working together, they managed to heave the door open. It swung back on protesting hinges, revealing a dark, square opening in the floor. A set of steep concrete steps led down into blackness. A musty, cool smell, the smell of a place that had not breathed fresh air in 60 years, wafted up to meet them. Frank shone a flashlight down the steps. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a small, square room. It was about 10 feet by 10 feet, with raw concrete walls. And against the far wall, there was a heavy, oak chest and 2 metal footlockers. They had found it. The lifeboat. They descended the steps, their feet crunching on a thin layer of dust. The air was cold and still. Frank aimed the flashlight at the oak chest. It was not locked. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a collection of leather pouches. Dorothy reached in and opened one. Gold coins spilled into her palm, their luster undimmed by the decades. Pre-1933 St. Gordon's double eagles. They gleamed in the flashlight's beam, a solid, tangible reality. "My God," Frank whispered. Dorothy opened the other pouches. More gold, and silver coins as well. And in a separate, oilskin-wrapped package, a collection of her mother's jewelry. A pearl necklace, a diamond brooch, simple, elegant pieces from another era. Next, they opened the footlockers. The first was filled with canned goods, their labels faded but the cans themselves still intact. Her father's survival rations. The second contained a small, hand-crank radio, blankets, and a metal box. Dorothy lifted the box out and placed it on the floor. She opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in another layer of oilskin, was a bundle of documents. On top was a thick, vellum paper, folded neatly. She carefully unfolded it. It was a deed. The official seal of the county was at the bottom, dated 1934. It granted ownership of a 15-acre parcel of land, described by metes and bounds, to her grandfather in exchange for $1 and other considerations. At the bottom, in her father's handwriting, was a note, the old county jail property. Worthless. Worthless. Maybe. But it was land. And it was theirs. They carried the chest and the metal box up the steps. It was a struggle. The gold was heavy. They loaded it into the van, concealing it under old blankets. Frank replaced the floorboards in the barn, scattering dust and debris over them to make them look undisturbed. He wedged the broken side door shut. From the outside, nothing looked amiss. As they drove away from the farm for the last time, Dorothy didn't look back. She was looking forward. Their first stop the next day was a coin dealer in a city 2 hours away. A discreet, professional man who worked out of a small office in a high-rise building. He examined the coins with a jeweler's loupe, his face impassive. "This is a remarkable collection," he said finally. "Very well preserved." He did some calculations. "Based on today's market price for gold, and the numismatic value of the pieces, I can offer you $280,000. Dorothy, the bookkeeper, had done her own research. She had expected around 250. "We'll take it," she said, her voice not betraying the immense wave of relief that washed over her. They left the office with a certified check. They were no longer poor. They were not rich, but they had capital. They had options. Their next stop was the county records office. Dorothy, armed with the old deed, spent a day with a clerk, tracking down the forgotten parcel of land. It was still on the books, ownership unchanged since 1934. The county had essentially forgotten about it. The back taxes owed were minimal, less than $1,000. "It's the old county jail," the clerk said, peering at a dusty plat map. "Hasn't been used since the 50s. They built the new detention center out by the highway. Place is a ruin, I hear." Dorothy paid the back taxes and filed the paperwork to have the deed officially recorded in their name. For the sum of $987.53, they became the proud owners of a ruin. They drove out to see it that afternoon. It was located on a neglected road at the industrial edge of the county, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The building was a 2-story block of brutalist concrete and brick, its windows either boarded up or broken. Weeds grew thick and high, threatening to swallow the building whole. It was ugly. It was forbidding. It was perfect. Frank got out of the van and rattled the padlocked gate. He peered through the fence. "Solid construction," he said, his voice full of a strange admiration. "Poured concrete. Brick facade. They built things to last back then." Dorothy looked at the grim, grey structure. Where Frank saw solid construction, she saw a fortress. A place to be safe. "It's still standing," she said. Frank looked at her, then back at the jail. A slow grin spread across his face. "Well then," he said. "I guess we'd better get to work." That night, they didn't park in a supermarket lot. They parked in front of their own gate. Frank cut the padlock with a pair of bolt cutters he'd bought that afternoon. The screech of the metal was the sound of a key turning in the lock of their new home. He swung the gate open, and they drove their rattling white van onto their own property. The next day, the work began. Frank, reborn, was a force of nature. He started by clearing the weeds and debris from around the building, working with a relentless energy that belied his 70-plus years. He bought a heavy-duty generator, and the sound of power tools soon echoed across the neglected property. Dorothy, meanwhile, set up an office in the passenger seat of the van. With her laptop and a new set of digital ledgers, she became the quartermaster of their small army of two. She managed the budget, sourced materials, and navigated the labyrinth of permits required to bring a derelict building back to life. They made their first significant purchase at an independent hardware store in the nearby town. It was a small, old-fashioned place called Hobbs Hardware, run by a man their own age named Earl Hobbs. He was a lanky man with a dry wit and hands as calloused as Frank's. Frank was looking for a specific type of plumbing fitting for the jail's ancient pipes. Earl didn't have it in stock. "Haven't seen one of those in 30 years, Earl said, peering at the rusted piece Frank had brought in. "What in the world are you working on?" "The old county jail," Frank said simply. Earl raised an eyebrow. "That old wreck? I thought the county was going to tear it down." "We bought it," Dorothy said from behind him. "We're fixing it up." Earl looked from Frank's determined face to Dorothy's steady gaze. He saw their old van in the parking lot, loaded with tools and lumber. He didn't see crazy people. He saw workers. He saw people like himself. "Well, I'll be," he said. He disappeared into the back of the store and returned a few minutes later, blowing dust off a small, heavy brass fitting. "Found one. Been sitting on a shelf since my father ran this place. No charge. Call it a welcome to the neighborhood." It wasn't charity. It was a gesture of respect from one tradesman to another. It was the beginning of their first alliance. The first weeks were brutal. The inside of the jail was a disaster. Peeling paint, rusted cell doors, and a thick layer of grime covered everything. The plumbing was shot, the wiring was a fire hazard. But the bones were good. The concrete was sound. The steel was strong. Frank started with a single cell block on the ground floor. He tore out the old bunks and toilets. He scrubbed the walls and floors. He was a carpenter, not a plumber or an electrician, but he was a quick study. He spent his evenings reading books he'd bought on home repair, and his days putting the knowledge into practice. He worked with a joyful intensity. He was covered in dust and grime, but his eyes were clear and bright. He was building again. He had a purpose. Dorothy converted one of the old administrative offices into a temporary living space. She put down a clean sheet of plywood for a floor, scrubbed the walls, and bought 2 comfortable cots. It was small and stark, but it was theirs. They made their first real breakthrough in the 3rd week. After days of struggle, Frank managed to get the water running in one of the bathrooms. He had replaced a whole section of corroded iron pipe with new copper. He turned the valve, and after a shudder and a groan, clean water flowed from the tap. He called for Dorothy. She came and stood in the doorway, watching the water run. Frank was grinning, his face smudged with dirt. He looked 10 years younger. That night, they had their first hot showers in months. The simple luxury felt like an unimaginable treasure. A few days later, a young woman appeared at their gate. She couldn't have been more than 20. She was visibly pregnant and had a purple bruise fading on her cheek. She was carrying a single, overstuffed backpack. "I saw the lights," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I heard, people said you were fixing this place up. I don't have anywhere else to go." Her name was Sarah. She had run away from an abusive boyfriend and had been sleeping in her car until it broke down. Dorothy looked at the girl's desperate eyes. She saw the same fear and displacement she had felt standing in front of the Starlight Motel. Frank came and stood beside her. He looked at Sarah, then at the half-renovated cell block. "We have a spare room," Dorothy said. "It's not much, but it's clean and it's safe." They gave Sarah one of the cells Frank had just finished cleaning. He had removed the barred door, and the room was small but bright, with a window that looked out onto the newly cleared yard. Dorothy gave her a cot, clean blankets, and a hot meal. Sarah was the first piece of their found family. She was a quiet presence at first, but after a few days, she started to help. She would sweep the floors, help Dorothy organize supplies, or just sit with her while she worked on her budget. She was healing. The project began to take on a new dimension. They weren't just building a home for themselves anymore. A week later, Leo arrived. He was 17, with a shock of dyed blue hair and a sullen expression that didn't quite hide the fear in his eyes. Earl Hobbs had sent him. His parents kicked him out, Earl explained quietly to Dorothy over the phone. Found out he had a boyfriend. Kid knows his way around a circuit board. He's smart. Just needs a place to land. Leo was wary and defensive. But Frank, instead of lecturing him, handed him a multimeter and a roll of electrical tape. The wiring in the East Wing is a rat's nest, he said. Think you can make sense of it? Leo, who had been expecting a sermon, was taken aback. He took the tools and got to work. And he was good. Very good. He traced the old, cloth-wrapped wires, diagnosed the shorts, and began the painstaking process of replacing them with new, up-to-code wiring. He found his purpose in the hum of electricity, just as Frank had found his in the grain of wood. The ecosystem of the old jail was beginning to form. Frank was the master builder. Dorothy was the administrator. Sarah, whose quiet empathy was a balm to everyone, became the heart of the home. Leo became the tech wizard, not only fixing the wiring but also setting up a surprisingly robust Wi-Fi network using a series of cheap routers. The snowball was rolling. Earl Hobbs would drop off materials he got on clearance, a pallet of mismatched tiles, a dozen gallons of mistinted paint. Might as well use it, he'd say with a shrug. Then came Mr. Henderson. A widower in his late 60s, he had lost his small house to a reverse mortgage scam after his wife died. He was living in a shelter, but he was a proud, private man, and it was crushing his spirit. He heard about the jail from a volunteer at the shelter. He showed up one morning, holding a small box of seedlings. "I'm a gardener," he announced. "This place has good southern exposure. I can grow food." Frank helped him build raised beds out of scrap lumber. Mr. Henderson, with hands that seemed to coax life from barren soil, began to cultivate the patch of dirt by the south wall. Soon, neat rows of lettuce, tomatoes, and beans began to sprout. The old jail was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of work, of quiet conversation, of life. The small community ate together every evening in the former mess hall, which Frank had converted into a warm, inviting dining room with a long table he built himself. They weren't a charity case. They were a crew. Everyone had a job. Everyone contributed. Sarah took over the cooking. Leo managed all things electrical. Mr. Henderson provided the fresh vegetables. It was a self-sustaining system, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. They were the forgotten people, and they had found a place to belong. But such a strange and sudden flowering does not go unnoticed. Their nearest neighbor, a man named Henderson who lived in a tidy bungalow a quarter-mile down the road, had been watching their activities with growing suspicion. He saw the old van, the growing pile of construction debris, the lights on at all hours. He saw different people coming and going. He didn't see a community being born. He saw a blight. An infestation. He saw vagrants and squatters. He called the county code enforcement office. The threat arrived on a bright, sunny morning in the form of a county official named Mr. Clark. He was a man who seemed to have been born in a grey suit, with a clipboard in his hand and a permanent expression of weary disapproval. He walked onto the property as if he were wading through filth. He took in the half-finished construction, the piles of lumber, the vegetable garden. His eyes narrowed. "I'm from the County Office of Code Enforcement," he announced to Frank, who had met him at the gate. "We've had a complaint." Clark spent an hour walking through the building, making notes on his clipboard. He saw a construction site being used as a residence. He saw violations. Dozens of them. He ignored the quality of Frank's carpentry, the neatness of Leo's wiring. He saw only what was not yet finished. "This is completely unacceptable," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "This building was condemned for a reason. You can't just move in and start living here. This is an illegal occupancy." "We're bringing it up to code," Frank said, his voice level. "We have the permits." "You have permits for construction, not for habitation," Clark snapped. He tore a sheet from a pad and tacked it to the front door. It was a bright orange notice. "Condemnation order." "You have 30 days, Clark said, his voice cold and final. 30 days to bring this entire structure into full compliance with all residential building codes, or we will commence demolition proceedings. And I mean full compliance. Electrical, plumbing, structural, fire safety. Everything. And then, it will have to pass a final inspection. By me." He looked around at the vast, unfinished building, then back at Frank. A smug little smile played on his lips. He knew it was an impossible task. 30 days was not enough time. The cost would be astronomical. "Good day," he said, and walked back to his car, leaving the orange notice fluttering on the door like a death sentence. That evening, the mood in the dining hall was somber. The condemnation notice felt like an executioner's warrant. 30 days. It couldn't be done. The progress they had made, the home they had built, it was all about to be turned into a pile of rubble. Frank was quiet, the weight of the task pressing down on him. Dorothy was looking at her budget, the numbers refusing to add up. Sarah was trying to comfort Mr. Henderson, who was staring blankly at his plate. Leo was angrily stabbing at his food. "It's not fair," Leo said, his voice cracking. "We were building something good here." "The world isn't fair," Mr. Henderson said softly. "It just is." Into this despair, a single voice cut through. It was Sarah. "My uncle," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "He's a plumber. A master plumber. He owns his own business." Everyone looked at her. "He felt bad about my situation," she continued. "He told me if I ever needed anything at all, I should call him." A spark. A tiny, fragile spark in the overwhelming darkness. "Call him," Dorothy said. Sarah's uncle, a gruff but kind man named Mike, showed up the next morning with 2 of his apprentices and a truck full of equipment. He surveyed Frank's plumbing work. "Not bad for a wood butcher," he grunted, which from him was high praise. "But this is a 2-week job for my crew." "We'll get it done," he refused to take any money. "Call it a gift for my future grandnephew," he said, nodding toward Sarah's belly. Mike's arrival was a catalyst. Leo, inspired, called a friend from a computer club, a girl who was a genius at networking. She came and helped him properly ground the entire electrical system and install a network of linked smoke detectors. Dorothy went to see Earl Hobbs. She laid the situation out for him, her voice calm and factual. She didn't ask for help. She simply stated the problem. Earl listened, his expression grim. When she was finished, he picked up the phone. He started making calls. He called a retired electrician he played poker with. He called a roofer he'd known for 40 years. He called a drywaller whose kids had worked for him in the summer. "I'm calling in some favors," he said to Dorothy. "A lot of us old-timers, we're tired of seeing good work get torn down and cheap junk get put up. We're tired of seeing good people get pushed around." That Saturday, a fleet of pickup trucks and work vans descended on the old jail. A dozen retired tradesmen, men in their 60s and 70s with lifetimes of experience in their hands, showed up with their own tools. The greybeards, as Leo affectionately called them, swarmed the building. It was a symphony of skilled labor. The electricians worked with Leo, upgrading the main panel. The roofers patched the last of the leaks. The drywall crew, with astonishing speed and precision, began to hang and finish sheetrock, turning the stark concrete cell blocks into smooth, clean rooms. Frank was in heaven. He was no longer a lone builder, but a foreman, a peer among masters. He moved from crew to crew, consulting, assisting, his expertise respected and valued. The community rallied. Sarah organized a food station, keeping everyone supplied with coffee and sandwiches. Mr. Henderson brought in vegetables from his garden. The town was buzzing. People would drive by slowly, marveling at the transformation. Some would drop off cases of water or boxes of donuts. They saw what Clark the inspector had refused to see, not a blight, but a barn raising. A resurrection. As the 30-day deadline approached, the news of their project reached the city. It reached Mark Miller. He arrived one afternoon, unannounced, driving a different, even more expensive-looking sedan. He got out of the car, his face a thundercloud of fury and embarrassment. He strode onto the property, past the working crews, past the flourishing garden, and confronted Frank and Dorothy, who were taking a rare break on the front steps. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous so the others couldn't hear. Frank just looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I've been getting calls," Mark spat. "People are talking. The local paper even called my office. Son abandons parents, who then turn jail into homeless shelter. Is that the headline you want? You're making a spectacle. You're ruining my reputation. You're ruining the family name." Dorothy stood up. She was shorter than her son, but at that moment, she seemed to tower over him. Her voice, when she spoke, was not angry. It was cold and clear as ice. "You sold our home," she said. "You took our lives and you sold them for a profit." "I did what was best for you," he insisted. "No," Dorothy said. "You did what was best for you. You took the money to cover David's bad investment, and you pocketed the rest. You left us in a motel to rot. You never called. There was no retirement villa, was there, Mark?" He had the grace to look away. "That motel," she continued, her voice unwavering, "was the end of the family name. We are building a new one here. These people," she gestured to the crews working, to Sarah watering the garden, to Leo running a cable, "they are our family now. They did not discard us." Mark stared at her, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief. He was used to winning arguments, to dominating rooms. But he had no leverage here. His money, his influence, they were worthless. He was facing a moral authority he could not comprehend. He looked at Frank, seeking some crack in the wall. "Dad? Are you going to let her talk to me like this?" Frank said nothing. He just stood up and put his arm around Dorothy's shoulders. His silence was more damning than any words could have been. Defeated, Mark turned and stalked back to his car. He gunned the engine and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. He did not look back. The 30th day arrived. It was a grey, overcast morning. The work was done. The last coat of paint was dry. The last outlet cover was screwed into place. The building was transformed. It was clean, solid, and safe. Mr. Clark arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, his clipboard in hand, an anticipatory smirk on his face. He was here to sign the demolition order. Frank and Dorothy met him at the door. "We're ready for the inspection," Frank said. Clark's smirk faltered. He stepped inside. The foyer, once a grimy, peeling mess, was now bright and clean, with a new tile floor and freshly painted walls. He walked through the building in stunned silence. He saw the new plumbing, the neatly labeled electrical panel, the smoke detectors in every room and hallway. He saw the smooth, perfect walls of the former cells, now small but cheerful bedrooms. He saw the gleaming commercial-grade kitchen, which Sarah's uncle had helped them source from a restaurant auction. He saw the fire extinguishers, mounted at regular intervals. He ran his hand along a windowsill Frank had crafted from reclaimed oak. The workmanship was flawless. He flicked a light switch. The light came on. He turned a faucet in a bathroom. Hot water flowed instantly. He went room by room, his clipboard forgotten in his hand, his expression shifting from disbelief to grudging respect, and finally, to something approaching awe. He was a man of codes and regulations, of right angles and proper clearances. And everything he saw was not just compliant. It was perfect. He finished his tour back in the foyer. Frank, Dorothy, Sarah, Leo, and Mr. Henderson stood waiting. The greybeards were there too, standing in a silent, formidable group. Clark looked at the sea of expectant faces. He looked at the orange condemnation notice still tacked to the door. He walked over, pulled it down, and slowly, deliberately, tore it into 4 pieces. He turned back to them. "This isn't a jail anymore," he said, his voice quiet. "This is a home." He took a pen from his pocket, initialed the final inspection form on his clipboard, and signed his name at the bottom. "You passed," he said. "Congratulations." A cheer went up. The release of tension was explosive. People were hugging, laughing. Frank and Dorothy stood in the middle of it all, a quiet island of calm. They had won. The story did not end there. A young reporter from the local paper, the one who had called Mark, had been following the saga. She had been tipped off by Earl Hobbs. Her article, "The Jailbirds of Liberty Road," was published the following week. It told the whole story: the improbable renovation, the community of the forgotten, the army of retired tradesmen. It was a story of resilience, dignity, and community. And while it was careful not to name names, it told the story of an elderly couple left in a motel by their sons after their family farm was sold. The article was picked up by a wire service. It went viral. Donations began to pour in, small checks from strangers, truckloads of furniture from a local business, an offer from a solar company to install panels on the roof for free. Dorothy, overwhelmed, had to open a separate bank account and form a non-profit organization to manage it all. The consequences for the sons were swift. The story, with its thinly veiled details, was a professional and social disaster for Mark. His carefully curated image of a successful, family-oriented developer was shattered. Clients pulled out of deals. His partners grew distant. The shame was a constant, low-level hum in his life. For David, the guilt was a tidal wave. He had been weak, complacent, and complicit. The public airing of their family's dirty laundry was the final straw. The community at the newly christened Liberty House settled into a peaceful, productive rhythm. Frank's workshop was now a magnificent, fully equipped space, built in a new outbuilding funded by donations. He spent his days teaching his skills to Leo and other young people who found their way to their door. Mr. Henderson's garden expanded, and they began selling their surplus produce at a local farmer's market, providing a steady stream of income for the non-profit. Sarah had her baby, a healthy boy named Franklin. The sound of his laughter became the new heartbeat of the house. They were a beacon for the lost and the discarded. They took in an elderly woman who had lost her home in a fire, a young veteran struggling with PTSD, a family that had been living in their car. Liberty House was never a shelter, it was always a home. A place to rest, to heal, and to rebuild. One day, about 6 months after the inspection, a familiar, beaten-up car pulled up to the gate. It was David. He looked thinner, his face etched with anxiety. He found Dorothy in the garden, helping Mr. Henderson tie up tomato plants. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. She looked at him, her expression neutral. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "This is for you. It's my half of the money from the farm. All of it. I sold my condo." He held it out to her. Dorothy wiped her hands on her apron but made no move to take the envelope. "We don't need your money, David. Please," he begged. I have to. I haven't slept in months. What we did," his voice broke. "It was wrong. I was a coward. I let Mark. I just went along. I'm so sorry." Tears were streaming down his face now. He was a broken man. Dorothy looked at her son, at the genuine remorse in his eyes. She felt not anger, but a deep, weary sadness. "What do you want, David?" she asked. I don't know. Forgiveness." At that moment, Frank walked over from his workshop, wiping sawdust from his hands. He saw David, saw the tears, the profit envelope. He looked at Dorothy. He walked past David and pointed to a large pile of lumber near the workshop. "We need shelves in the pantry," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "A lot of them. It's a two-man job." David stared at him, confused. "What?" Frank looked him in the eye. "The pantry. We need shelves. Are you going to help, or are you just going to stand there?" David, the man who had worked in finance his whole life, who wouldn't know a hammer from a handsaw, looked at the pile of lumber, then back at his father. He nodded slowly. "Yes. Okay." He spent the rest of the day working alongside his father. He was clumsy. He hit his thumb with the hammer. He measured boards incorrectly. But he didn't complain. He worked. And as he worked, he began to talk. He told them about the pressure from Mark, about his own financial desperation, about the shame that had been eating him alive. Dorothy brought them sandwiches for lunch. She didn't take the envelope, but she didn't tell him to leave. The door wasn't closed. It was just ajar. Forgiveness wasn't a word. It was a shared task. It was the construction of shelves. Mark never came. A year passed. Then another. Liberty House thrived. It became a model for other communities, a testament to the power of a second chance. One warm summer evening, Frank and Dorothy sat on the front porch they had built together. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The sounds of the evening were a gentle symphony, children laughing in the yard, the clatter of pans from the kitchen where Sarah was teaching a new resident how to cook, the low hum of conversation from the workshop. Dorothy held Frank's hand. His knuckles were still swollen, his fingers calloused, but his touch was as gentle as it had ever been. Tucked into the frame of the porch window was a small, faded photograph from their wedding day, a relic from a life that felt both a million miles and a moment away. Frank had been quiet for a while, watching the sky. "You know," he said softly, "your father would have liked this place." Dorothy smiled. "He would have said the walls needed to be thicker." Frank chuckled, a warm, rumbling sound. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon. The world was vast and indifferent, and it had tried to break them. It had failed. They had taken the worst of it and built something better. Not a fortress against the world, but a light within it. As darkness fell, a single, bright light flickered on above the porch. It was a simple, unadorned bulb in a sturdy, weatherproof fixture that Frank had wired himself. It cut a warm, yellow circle into the twilight, a beacon of welcome, of safety, of home. It burned steadily, pushing back the night.